In the winter of 1942, Arctic winds swept across the North Atlantic like a living force, swallowing entire horizons in white. Few today realize just how vital and how deadly this frozen frontier became during the early years of the Second World War. The Royal Air Force's Coastal Command, often overshadowed by the better-known battles in Europe and North Africa, was fighting its own war here, over thousands of miles of empty ocean, in aircraft barely suited for the extremes of the far north. And it was here, amid shifting storms and unrelenting cold, that a series of disappearances would begin to unfold. For the men of No. 210 and No. 86 squadrons, operating from bases such as RAF Oban in Scotland and Reykjavik in Iceland, the Arctic mission was deceptively simple: find and track German naval forces before they could strike Allied convoys. Reports of the battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst moving into Norway's fjords had set alarm bells ringing in London. Churchill himself once wrote, "The destruction or paralysis of the Tirpitz is the greatest event at sea at the present time." To protect the steady flow of Lend-Lease supplies bound for Murmansk, long-range reconnaissance flights became essential. Yet every sortie meant hours of flying over waters so cold that survival time was measured in minutes. The struggle began from the moment crews stepped onto the tarmac. Catalina flying boats, Hudson bombers, and Sunderland patrol aircraft were sturdy, dependable machines, but their engines labored in temperatures they were never designed for. Oil thickened. Carburetors froze. Navigational instruments fogged over. Even heated gloves failed at altitude. One observer from No. 210 Squadron later wrote in his diary, "The cold doesn't sting, it crushes. It takes your breath like an unseen hand." But the mission had to continue because German surface ships were slipping through the fjords, waiting for the chance to attack convoys like PQ-17 and PQ-18, whose losses had already shaken the Admiralty. Historical records show that early 1942 was a turning point. The German Navy increased its patrols, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft pushed farther into the Norwegian Sea. This forced RAF crews to fly longer routes, often to the very edge of their fuel limits. The distances were so vast that a single miscalculation could send an aircraft into the sea with no hope of rescue. The crews knew this. They accepted it. But what they didn't know was that the Arctic held more threats than German guns alone. By late February, radio logs began capturing irregular messages from patrolling aircraft, short, clipped reports of unexpected icing, magnetic disturbances, sudden instrument failures. Engineers blamed the weather. Intelligence analysts blamed German electronic interference. Both explanations made sense, and neither was entirely satisfactory. The Arctic was large enough to swallow an aircraft whole. Yet in several cases search teams found nothing, not a life raft, not a trailing oil slick, not even a shard of metal washed ashore. In wartime, aircraft go missing. But here, in this vast and deadly emptiness, they seem to vanish entirely. One revealing entry comes from an operations summary at RAF Sulm Vo, noting that navigational difficulties remain severe due to unpredictable wind shifts and intermittent radio bearings. It was a diplomatic way of saying that nobody truly understood the Arctic's behavior. Compass deviation near the magnetic pole was extreme. Cloud layers could stretch for miles. Pilots flying low to avoid detection often risked clipping waves that rose without warning. And when the storms came, rolling walls of snow known as Arctic whiteouts, even experienced flight crews could lose all spatial awareness. Investigators later concluded that many early losses were likely due to these conditions. But certain cases defied easy explanation. As the pressure on the Arctic convoys grew, so did the number of missing flights. In March alone, 2 Catalinas failed to return from routine patrols, both last reported between Iceland and Jan Mayen Island. No contact after initial check, their logs read. The phrasing became painfully familiar. Crews were pushing deeper into enemy-threatened waters, grappling with failing engines, overstressed airframes, and a landscape as unforgiving as any battlefield. The struggle to maintain control of the aircraft, of navigation, of morale, was constant. Looking back, historians have come to view these early missions as a lesson in human endurance. Technology lagged behind the demands of the Arctic, and the crews who flew there relied as much on instinct as on instruments. Their courage was unquestioned, their fate often unknown. Modern aviators studying these logs note how little margin for error existed. A minor failure in more forgiving climates could become fatal in the north. Yet the most unsettling aspect of these flights was not the harshness of the environment, but how easily it concealed what happened. Even today, oceanographers estimate that many crash sites lie thousands of meters below the surface, beyond the reach of recovery efforts. And so, as 1942 progressed, The pattern of disappearances began to raise deeper questions, questions the RAF could not fully answer. Why were some flights lost without a trace, while others at least managed a final distress call? Were German ships or aircraft involved in more incidents than the records suggest? Or did the Arctic simply claim what it touched? These questions set the stage for the mysteries that would follow, mysteries that only deepened as the war entered its next year. By the summer of 1942, the Arctic had become one of the most heavily monitored, yet least understood, battlegrounds of the war. RAF Coastal Command's reconnaissance flights were now indispensable to Allied operations, and the crews assigned to them carried a responsibility far beyond the quiet isolation of the North Atlantic sky. Yet it was in these very months, when intelligence pressure peaked and the German Navy grew increasingly evasive, that several RAF aircraft vanished without explanation. Their losses marked the beginning of a pattern investigators would struggle to understand for decades. The missions themselves were unforgiving. Catalina flying boats from No. 210 Squadron and Hudson bombers from No. 86 Squadron were dispatched daily to shadow German naval groups maneuvering between Norway's fjords and the open sea. With convoys PQ-16, PQ-17, and PQ-18 suffering heavy assaults, every sighting report could shape decisions made in London, Scapa Flow, or the Admiralty War Room. The crews flew at low altitudes to confirm ship silhouettes, pushing through sleet, wind shear, and unpredictable icing that could form on wings within minutes. Mechanical failures, already common in cold weather, became downright hazardous when aircraft were forced to change altitude quickly to avoid detection. The struggle intensified in July, when weather fronts began moving rapidly across the Norwegian Sea. On the 9th of that month, a Catalina designated W-8415 transmitted a partial distress call, reporting severe icing, losing altitude. Radio operators noted the sudden drop in signal quality, as if the aircraft had descended below the range of standard reception or encountered atmospheric interference. Moments later, the transmission cut off entirely. Search efforts began immediately, with Hudsons and Sunderlands sweeping hundreds of square miles. But after 3 days, the operation ended with nothing to show, not a raft, not a floating wing panel, not a trace of the 9 men aboard. It was not an isolated incident. Within weeks, 2 more aircraft disappeared under similar circumstances. A Hudson from No. 86 Squadron reported abrupt, instrument loss, before vanishing from the grid. Another Catalina, flying from RAF Kaldadarns in Iceland, made a final call referring to unexpected cloud bank, visibility 0, turning. That aircraft also vanished without leaving a single identifiable remnant. While wartime aviation accidents were far from rare, the total absence of wreckage struck many as unusual. Typically, even in violent impacts, some debris surfaced, aircraft fabric, flotation gear, or fuel sheens. Here there was only silence. An insight into the growing concern can be found in an internal intelligence summary dated August 1942. The document noted repeated loss of contact with patrol units operating in Zone Blue, a region of the Norwegian Sea known for extreme weather shifts. While the report avoided speculation, one handwritten annotation in the margin, likely from a squadron leader, read, "Jamming?" German electronic warfare capabilities were improving, and the Luftwaffe had begun using radar deception techniques along the Norwegian coastline. Still, no evidence linked these advancements directly to the disappearances. For many, the Arctic itself remained the primary suspect. The reveal came when analysts compared radio logs from multiple squadrons and noticed a troubling pattern. Most distress calls ended abruptly, without the fading signal typically associated with controlled descents or ditching attempts. Instead, the transmissions stopped instantly, as if power had been cut or the aircraft had disintegrated midair. This suggested several possibilities: catastrophic structural failure, sudden impact with the ocean, or a rapid loss of control that prevented any further communication. If a catastrophic breakup had occurred, some debris should have floated. That none did troubled investigators deeply. Another factor emerged: icing. Arctic supercooled droplets could accumulate on aircraft surfaces at alarming rates, overwhelming even the most experienced pilots. A diary entry from a No. 86 Squadron flight engineer captured the fear vividly: "Ice thickens faster than you can pray. It slides across the wings like a living thing. There's a point where lift just slips away and you feel the machine start to sag. That moment stays with you." Modern flight analysts reviewing archived meteorological data note that 1942 saw unusual temperature fluctuations in the Norwegian Sea, creating layers of freezing fog and supercooled rain. This would have been invisible to crews flying above or below these layers, making them particularly deadly. But even this explanation fails to account for the stunning lack of physical evidence. The application of modern understanding has brought some clarity, though not complete resolution. Deepwater oceanographers point out that parts of the Norwegian Sea plunged to depths exceeding 3,000 meters. An aircraft entering those waters intact would be nearly impossible to locate without modern sonar. Even if it fragmented, the Arctic's powerful currents could scatter remnants across vast distances. In essence, the sea had both the depth and the mobility to conceal any trace. Still, for families waiting for closure and commanders desperate for answers, the vanishing of these flights left lingering doubts. The summer of 1942 had shown that Coastal Command was flying on the edge of its capabilities, and the line between mission success and catastrophe was razor thin. These mysterious disappearances forced new questions into wartime conversations, questions about weather, equipment, enemy activity, and the limits of human endurance. And as the war transitioned into 1943, those concerns only deepened, especially as a new target loomed large in the frigid north, the elusive German battleship Tirpitz. By early 1943, the Arctic War had entered a new and more treacherous chapter. The German battleship Tirpitz, hiding within Norway's labyrinth of fjords, had become a specter haunting Allied planners. Capable of threatening every convoy bound for the Soviet Union, its mere presence forced the Royal Navy and RAF Coastal Command into a constant state of vigilance. Few outside military circles understood how much pressure this single warship imposed on the Allies. And fewer still knew that, in the effort to track it, several RAF aircraft would vanish in circumstances that remain unresolved to this day. The struggle began with the extraordinary distances involved. To monitor Tirpitz, the RAF relied on aircraft from No. 330 Norwegian Squadron flying Catalina flying boats from bases at RAF Oben and later RAF Sullom Alongside them, No. 502 Squadron operated Halifax and Whitley aircraft on long-range reconnaissance missions. These crews were asked to push deeper into enemy-held waters, beyond the safe patrol zones of previous years. The fjords remained cloaked in perpetual cloud and mountainous terrain, forcing reconnaissance aircraft to fly hours over open sea before even approaching the Norwegian coastline. For the airmen, the missions became increasingly tense. The Luftwaffe had intensified its defensive operations around the fjords, deploying radar-equipped night fighters and strengthening anti-aircraft batteries along the coast. The Germans knew that if the Allies found Tirpitz at sea, it would be vulnerable. British planners understood this as well, and so they dispatched aircraft day after day, demanding sightings that could change the course of the war. One crew member wrote in his logbook, "Every sortie felt like a coin toss between ice fighters or not coming back at all." Historical records identify a shift during spring 1943. RAF radar reports and wireless logs began showing unexplained anomalies. Crews from No. 330 Squadron reported sudden drops in altimeter readings, erratic magnetic compass behavior, and unexpected echoes on ASV air-to-surface vessel radar screens. At first, intelligence analysts attributed this to the rugged terrain of the Norwegian coastline, which often produced false returns. But in several cases, these anomalies appeared far from land, over open water where no such interference should have occurred. The reveal came with the disappearance of a Halifax from No. 502 Squadron in May 1943. The aircraft was tasked with shadowing suspected German fleet movements near the Lofoten Islands. Its last radio message mentioned multiple returns on ASV, uncertain bearing, followed by a request for a new navigational fix. The signal ended abruptly. Search teams dispatched from Iceland and the Shetlands found no debris. Weather had been rough but not catastrophic. German records released after the war indicated no fighter intercepts or flak engagements in the area. The disappearance raised uncomfortable questions. What exactly had the Halifax detected before it vanished, and why had its transmission cut off so suddenly? Another incident soon followed. A Catalina from No. 330 Squadron vanished during a patrol east of Bear Island. Its final recorded message referenced persistent interference, cannot maintain signal. When Norwegian resistance sources later confirmed no German air activity in the region, intelligence brokers grew uneasy. The RAF launched an internal review, concluding that enemy radar jamming might be responsible. However, jamming alone could not down an aircraft, nor erase it from the ocean's surface. The application of modern analysis has revealed that German radar sites in northern Norway were experimenting with new frequency techniques during this period, including early forms of passive disruption. These could distort ASV radar readings and potentially overwhelm older receivers. But contemporary experts caution against assigning too much weight to this theory. Jamming could confuse a crew, perhaps contribute to navigational errors, but it could not account for the complete absence of physical evidence. As the losses mounted, flight crews grew increasingly wary. One navigator recalled decades later, "The sea felt wrong that year. You trusted your instruments, but only up to a point. Sometimes the radar would flicker with shapes that made no sense, too fast, too large, or simply disappearing at the edge of the screen." His testimony echoed similar reports from other squadrons. If these anomalies were caused by weather, they were unlike any phenomena crews had encountered before. If they were caused by German interference, the effectiveness of such technology exceeded what post-war intelligence assessments believed was possible. The RAF struggle to understand these events produced countless internal memoranda. Some reports blamed airframe stress from extended missions. Others suggested catastrophic icing as aircraft descended through unstable cloud layers. A few hinted at navigational drift compounded by magnetic deviation near the polar regions. All were plausible. None fully explained the suddenness of the disappearances or the uniform lack of debris. And so the mysteries deepened. Beneath the tactical urgency of tracking tirpitz lay a quieter, more unsettling pattern: aircraft vanishing in areas with no German activity, in weather not severe enough to guarantee total destruction, and under conditions that produced radio logs both incomplete and unnerving. It was within this climate of uncertainty that the RAF faced one of its most perplexing losses later that year: the disappearance of a 210 Squadron Catalina tasked with a routine flight to Jan Mayen Island. An incident that, like so many, left behind questions that still linger in the cold Arctic air. In October 1943, the Arctic War produced one of Coastal Command's most baffling disappearances, an incident still discussed by historians, navigators, and crash investigators trying to understand how an entire RAF crew could vanish on a flight considered routine. The aircraft was a consolidated PBY Catalina of No. 210 Squadron, operating from RAF Castle Archdale and temporarily staged forward in Iceland. Its mission, a standard transit toward Jan Mayen Island, a volcanic outpost used as a crucial weather and radio monitoring station supporting Allied operations in the northern Atlantic. By 1943, dozens of such flights had been completed without incident. Yet on this autumn day something went profoundly wrong. The struggle faced by the crew began long before takeoff. October brought the first surge of Arctic winter, a time when conditions changed unpredictably, sometimes within minutes. Jan Mayen itself was infamous for a weather phenomenon locals called the Devil's Breath. A fierce combination of freezing fog, gale-force winds, and vertical air drafts tumbling down from the island's glacier-capped Beerenberg volcano. Navigators respected Jan Mayen but feared its skies. Even experienced pilots from 210 Squadron, men who had flown over the Norwegian Sea since the earliest convoy battles, approached the region with caution. The Catalina took off shortly after dawn, flying under overcast skies with a plan to ascend above the cloud cover for most of the journey. The crew consisted of 9 men, a typical complement, experienced and familiar with northern patrol routes. Early radio transmissions were clear and routine: altitude checks, engine performance notes, and a meteorological update confirming moderate icing conditions near Jan Mayen's western approach. Nothing suggested trouble. The insight into what happened next comes from the final transmission, logged at 11:14 hours. The wireless operator reported severe icing at altitude, attempting descent, possible course correction required. The wording was calm, professional, and delivered in the clipped rhythm of a crew accustomed to adverse conditions. Yet after this message, the Catalina disappeared from radio contact entirely. No mayday. No follow-up. No fading signal. Just a sudden silence that signaled to operations officers that something catastrophic might have occurred. The reveal began with the search effort, one of the largest that Coastal Command launched that autumn. Aircraft from Iceland, the Shetlands, and even Greenland were directed into a coordinated grid pattern, sweeping hundreds of square miles around Jan Mayen. For 2 days, the region experienced turbulent weather, forcing Sunderlands and Catalinas to navigate through gusty seas and shifting cloud layers. When conditions finally cleared, search teams expected at least some sign of wreckage. Catalinas, after all, were designed to float even after emergency sea landings. Fuel tanks, survival rafts, and wing debris often remained buoyant for days. But for the 210 Squadron Catalina, nothing appeared. Not a torn piece of fabric, not an oil patch, not a single item of personal gear washed ashore. Norwegian coastwatchers stationed on Jan Mayen also reported no explosions, no low-flying aircraft, and no signs of an attempted landing. German records, examined after the war, confirmed no Luftwaffe presence in the area at the time. The absence of enemy involvement only deepened the puzzle. Some investigators proposed a theory of catastrophic icing. Severe ice buildup could have caused the Catalina to enter an unrecoverable stall, sending it plunging into the sea with such force that it shattered. Others suggested controlled flight into terrain. Perhaps the aircraft, struggling with iced-over instruments, descended too quickly and struck the steep cliffs of Jan Mayen's eastern coast. But these explanations faltered under scrutiny. Ice sheets and strong currents could scatter debris, yet complete disappearance remained difficult to explain. Even in violent impacts, portions of the wing, fuselage, or internal equipment typically resurfaced. Another theory centered on navigation. Magnetic deviation in the region was extreme, particularly during solar disturbances, making compass readings unreliable. If the crew miscalculated their position while descending through icing layers, they could have drifted far from the search grids. But this answer too felt incomplete. The weather station at Jan Mayen recorded no unusual magnetic events that day, and the Catalina's crew were trained to cross-check compass drift using astronavigation and radio bearings, unless the rapidly accumulating ice rendered those instruments useless. Modern analysis offers a mixture of explanations. Oceanographers note that the waters around Jan Mayen plunged quickly into abyssal depths exceeding 2,000 meters. A heavy aircraft entering those waters intact could sink rapidly, taking all floating debris down with it. Ice-packed surf could further obscure impact evidence. Combined, these factors provide a plausible, though still unsettling rationale for the total absence of traces. Yet for the families and squadron members who waited for news, none of these theories brought closure. A flight considered routine had simply vanished. No enemy engagement. No clear weather catastrophe. Only a final, calm transmission about icing, followed by silence. As winter settled over the Arctic, the disappearance of the Catalina forced Coastal Command to reassess its operational assumptions. If a well-trained crew could vanish under conditions classified as moderate risk, what other vulnerabilities remained unseen? What else was happening over the Norwegian Sea that diagrams, reports, and wartime charts couldn't explain? The answers would become even more troubling the following year, when an entire Hudson crew disappeared during an escort mission, on a day that, by all surviving accounts, began with calm seas and clear skies. By 1944, the Arctic Air War had grown both more sophisticated and more dangerous. The Allies were gaining momentum across Europe, yet in the far north the conflict remained as unpredictable as ever. Convoys JW-57 and JW-58, bound for Murmansk, were among the most protected of the war, escorted by destroyers, cruisers, and constant air patrols. But even with these improvements, one of the year's most baffling disappearances occurred during the escort of convoy JW-58, a loss that would confound both wartime investigators and post-war researchers for decades. The aircraft was a Lockheed Hudson from No. 269 Squadron, operating out of RAF Reykjavik. These twin-engine patrol bombers had been dependable workhorses since the early years of the war, known for their stability and reliability during long-range maritime flights. On March 29, 1944, the squadron was tasked with rotating patrol coverage around JW-58 as it pushed eastward through a corridor southwest of Bear Island. Weather reports described moderate swell and generally stable cloud layers, rarely used phrases in Arctic meteorology, and welcome news for the crews assigned to fly. The struggle began with the mission's endurance demands. Hudsons were not as long-legged as the newer Liberators, forcing crews to remain alert to fuel consumption, wind drift, and the constant threat of icing. Once airborne, the Hudson crew maintained regular radio check-ins. At 12:17 hours, they reported visual contact with several escort vessels and confirmed that the convoy was maintaining formation. Nothing in their tone suggested difficulty. In fact, the wireless log noted that conditions were favorable, an uncommon word in the annals of northern operations. Yet somewhere between 12:17 and 12:48, everything changed. The last known transmission, a brief and unremarkable message, patrol continuing as planned, offered no hint of distress. Shortly afterward, an escort destroyer noted what appeared to be an aircraft silhouette descending behind a distant cloud layer to the southwest. The sighting was fleeting and not clearly identified. The destroyer's log recorded it simply as possible aircraft, uncertain bearing. When the Hudson failed to make its scheduled position report at 13:30, operations officers began to worry. The reveal came as soon as the convoy escorts initiated a search. Ships swept the area, lookouts scanning for debris, oil slicks, or life rafts, anything that could indicate where the Hudson had gone down. Minutes turned to hours. Aircraft from No. 330 Norwegian Squadron were dispatched to expand the search perimeter. Even with calm seas and rare visibility, the teams found nothing. No floating wreckage. No signal flares. Not even a hint of oil on the surface. It was as if the Hudson had slipped beneath the waves without leaving the slightest trace. Post-war German records provided no evidence of fighter interception in the region that day. U-boats were present in the Norwegian Sea, but most were operating farther east or south of the convoy's route. Not a single log entry from submarines or Luftwaffe patrol units recorded an aircraft engagement. The circumstances once again pointed away from enemy action. The insight into potential causes centered on structural failure. After years of harsh service, Hudson airframes were known to develop stress fractures, particularly in the wings and engine mounts. Investigators considered whether a sudden failure at altitude could have caused the aircraft to enter a steep, unrecoverable dive, hitting the water at such velocity that few buoyant materials survived. This theory held weight but could not explain why the crew made no distress call. Another theory involved icing, always the Arctic's most persistent and lethal threat. If the Hudson descended into a freezing cloud bank or experienced asymmetric ice accumulation on its wings or propellers, it could have entered a spin or stalled too quickly for the crew to react. But the weather that day was not severe enough to suggest catastrophic icing. Conditions were documented as cold but stable, hardly the kind that normally brought down experienced patrol crews. A third possibility emerged from navigational drift. Even in clear skies, Arctic winds could shift unexpectedly, pushing aircraft far off course. If the Hudson had unknowingly drifted south of its expected patrol box, it might have crashed in an area never searched. But this raised another question. Why would an experienced crew drift so far without noticing? Compasses were checked regularly, and the visibility was unusually good. Modern oceanographic studies shed partial light on the mystery. The waters southwest of Bear Island concealed deep, narrow trenches plunging more than 2,500 meters. Seafloor currents run strong and unpredictable. An aircraft entering these waters intact could sink instantly and remain undiscoverable even with contemporary equipment. Debris might be dragged downward by sinking airframe components or torn apart by powerful subsurface currents. Yet even with these scientific insights, the total absence of floating materials remains unusual. Hudsons carried life rafts, flotation gear, and various lightweight components designed to remain buoyant after an impact. That none of these were found, even with calm seas and active searches, has left experts questioning whether the aircraft came down exactly where it was believed to be. The loss shook No. 269 Squadron deeply. Many of its crews had flown together since the early days of the war. The disappearance forced commanders to confront the uncomfortable reality that even on calm days, in seemingly stable conditions, the Arctic remained an environment capable of swallowing aircraft whole. And as the war neared its end, investigators revisited the string of disappearances stretching back to 1942, Catalinas, Hudsons, Halifaxes, all lost without trace in the same unforgiving expanse. The final chapter of this mystery would not be written by wartime patrols, but by post-war analysts who tried to reconcile the known facts with the unknown void left behind. Their findings would raise new questions about what the Arctic may still be hiding beneath its shifting, silent waters. In the months following Germany's surrender in 1945, Europe began piecing itself back together, but for RAF Coastal Command, the war's end brought little closure. Instead, it opened a new chapter of questions. As Allied intelligence branches were granted access to captured German archives, investigators hoped to finally resolve the fate of the aircraft lost over the Arctic between 1942 and 1944. They believed enemy records might reveal shoot-downs, radar traps, or fighter interceptions that had gone unreported during the war. But when the documents were examined, the results were startling. In case after case, German logs showed no aircraft engagements, no sightings, no flak activity, nothing that could account for the vanished Catalinas, Hudsons, or Halifaxes. The Arctic mysteries deepened, not diminished. The struggle now shifted from wartime urgency to peacetime analysis. Investigators from the RAF Air Historical Branch, the Admiralty, and even the newly formed scientific advisory committees attempted to reconstruct each disappearance with the full benefit of hindsight. Meteorologists reviewed historical weather charts. Oceanographers studied currents and sea temperatures. Engineers re-evaluated airframe durability in extreme cold. Survivors of Arctic patrol units were interviewed, their recollections invaluable yet sometimes fragmented by time. The aim was not to assign blame, but to understand how aircraft could vanish so completely, on missions that, while dangerous, did not always involve severe weather or enemy action. One insight came from reviewing pilot testimonies collected during and immediately after the war. A recurring theme emerged. Arctic flying created conditions beyond anything crews had experienced elsewhere. Navigators described magnetic compasses twitching like live things when nearing the polar latitudes. Radio operators recalled signal interference so abrupt and powerful it left their headsets ringing. Pilots spoke of descending through cloud bands only to see the altimeter behave erratically for several seconds, a deadly delay when flying close to the waves. At the time, these incidents were written off as quirks of the environment. Post-war analysts realized they were warning signs of the Arctic's unstable atmospheric layers and the limitations of 1940s-era navigation instruments. Still, these issues alone could not fully explain the total loss of multiple aircraft without a single trace. The reveal emerged gradually as more scientific fields contributed their expertise. Oceanographers studying the Norwegian and Barents Seas found that some regions contained exceptionally steep drop-offs, abyssal trenches where the seabed plunged thousands of meters in near-vertical descents. A heavy aircraft hitting the water at high speed could sink in minutes, nose-first, dragging surface debris down in the vortex of its descent. Additionally, the Arctic's powerful subsurface currents could scatter any remaining materials across vast distances. What looked like a calm ocean surface could conceal violent, shifting flows of water deep below. Engineers added another dimension. After examining maintenance logs and wear patterns on surviving Hudsons, Catalinas, and Halifaxes, they concluded that extreme cold weakened metal structures in unpredictable ways. Rivets contracted, lubricants thickened, and stress fractures could propagate rapidly under repeated icing cycles. A small failure, a cracked support beam, a frozen fuel line, might escalate into a catastrophic event in seconds. If such a failure occurred over deep water, and if the aircraft struck the sea at a steep angle, the result could be near total destruction. But even these explanations left gaps. Why did some disappearing aircraft send distress calls while others went silent without warning? Why did certain incidents occur under relatively good weather conditions? And why did the radio logs from multiple squadrons contain similar final phrases: icing, instrument loss, unexpected descent, cannot maintain signal? Some investigators suggested a convergence of hazards: icing, mechanical failure, atmospheric disturbances, and navigational errors working in unison. A situation where no single factor was fatal, but the combination became lethal. In the Arctic, such a chain reaction could happen quickly and invisibly. The application of modern technology provides new context. Satellite mapping, deep-sea sonar, and advanced oceanographic sensors have revealed how dynamic and unforgiving the Norwegian Sea truly is. Even today, wrecks from the Cold War era remain undiscovered. If aircraft lost in the 1960s and 1970s cannot be located with modern equipment, what chance is there for RAF patrol planes lost in the early 1940s, when search grids were inaccurate and resources limited? Yet the emotional weight of these disappearances remains. Families who waited for decades never received closure. Squadron mates who survived carried the memory of empty chairs in briefing rooms, of aircraft that simply did not return, of search missions that ended with nothing but wind and waves. For them, the Arctic silence was not an abstract scientific puzzle, it was a tangible absence. The close of this mystery brings us not to definitive answers, but to an understanding of the environment that swallowed these flights. The Arctic was and remains a place where the boundaries of human endurance, technology, and natural forces collide. The vanished RAF aircraft are part of that legacy, reminders of the risks crews accepted in a remote and unforgiving theater of war. Even today, as researchers scan the ocean floor with modern equipment, the Arctic keeps its secrets. Beneath its shifting currents and endless gray horizons lie the stories of missions that never returned, silent, cold, and unresolved, resting somewhere in the deep.